I was reading this article about how in Milan they restricted smoking in public areas. So even when you're smoking outdoors, you have to go to like these designated areas. And the article got a comment from this guy who was against the new restrictions. And he gave the classic response that these kinds of laws restrict people's freedoms of choice, and who is the government to say where we're going to smoke? And I thought it was so funny because you literally could have made the same argument when however many decades ago they like banned smoking indoors. Like, this is not a new debate. But I wanted to talk about it because I find it so interesting that on the right, there's this way of talking about freedom as if it was this thing that we can just maximize for everyone in society. And it sort of presupposes that there's this like set of policies or form of social organization which maximizes everyone's freedoms. But what I think the Milan case shows is that we can't really understand freedom on this abstract level. Within freedom, there's all these debates about priorities and whose freedom and when. And that's precisely because even in this freedom maximizing utopia, there's always a limit, right? Freedom is about delineating in what situations do we take away some individuals' freedoms for the benefit of everyone else's. And there's a million videos on the internet about the right wing and what they think and why they're so crazy, and it's kind of a tired subject. And the reason I'm bringing it up is less to like debunk this right wing way of thinking, but actually because I think it's a discussion that spans the political spectrum. And what I mean by that is that I think at least a few years ago, it was pretty easy to find people of any political ideology who believed that as a society, we have come a long way from the dark days where justice was like handed down by the king and might have involved tearing people apart with horses or burning them or branding them or whatever. And we now have this sort of evolved notion of justice and of what a free society looks like that is better than the one that came before. And I think in this sense, there actually is an abstract notion of freedom which is shared across the political spectrum. And what I want to suggest is that this idea of progress towards a more free society, whatever that means, is kind of misguided because our idea of what freedom is always a response to what our society perceives as its most pressing issues. And I think a really good example of this is in 2008 when Ecuador changed their constitution to include rights of nature, which basically means giving legal personhood to nature itself and placing certain restrictions on what you can do with it and how you can interact with it, especially if you're a business. And this was really interesting to me because it feels kind of awkward, like our current justice systems aren't really set up to protect nature. In fact, they're kind of set up to exploit it. Like, one of the foundations of our justice system is avoiding personal liability for things that your business does. It's a complete separation between the actions of the business and the consequences on like nature or the rest of society. But of course, this was an adaptation of the legal system to what people in Ecuador perceived as a pressing social issue. They realized that, hey, there's this imperative in our country and in all countries to exploit and sell off our natural resources as fast as possible. Now, of course, a law like this wouldn't really have made sense 300 years ago in like any part of the world, not because people weren't disrespecting nature, but because there wasn't this pressing social concern for the future of our ecosystems on this scale. The previous decades of freedom of Ecuadorians to exploit their natural resources had consequences for this other actor, nature, which was previously not really visible in the legal system. And so we return again to this interplay between one person or group's freedoms having important consequences for others. And in this competition between the priority for certain freedoms over others, I think the most interesting examples and contradictions come from the right. Like in 2023, when Argentina elected anarcho-capitalist Javier Milei, one of his first actions in office was to make it illegal for people to occupy the street with protest. And the reasoning behind it is really interesting. Milei, as an anarcho-capitalist, has an idea of freedom which is based on the free market. That is, the right for people to exchange goods. Now, of course, if people block the street with protests, this is a really big problem for trade. People can't get from point A to point B, people can't go to work to sell their labor. So, for the president and his supporters, the most important thing is attracting foreign capital and ensuring that businesses can continue to buy the labor of their workers. And so, between these instances of smoking in Milan, Ecuador's constitution, and Argentina restricting the right to protest, I think what we see is the way that our idea of freedom can't be understood outside of the particular issues of our time. So already we see that freedom isn't like this totalizing thing. Freedom is actually an act of delineation, of demarcating when are we going to make someone unfree? At what point do we decide that certain people or groups are no longer entitled to their freedoms because it comes at the expense of everyone else? Governing bodies and justice systems don't just exist. We have to build them and do justice every day. Of course, the way we build those justice systems and the values that are incorporated into them are always going to be conditioned by what we perceive to be the most pressing social issues. Now, I don't think this means that we can't compare societies and say that one has a preferable justice system or is more free than the other. But I do think we have to be careful when we tend towards the idea that we are somehow approaching an absolute freedom. Because, again, freedom can't exist in the abstract. It always relies on certain social structures to enforce that freedom and to ensure that for the rest of its citizens. In theory, that's the job of our government. It's nighttime and I'm editing this, but I just wanted to throw a conclusion on. I think what I'm trying to get at with all of this is to say that freedom is, I think, better conceived of as a competition of values. There's not really any absolute metric by which we can measure which society is the freest. I think, in principle, that's what strikes me as off with the way that libertarians talk about freedom, as if it was just a dial that you could turn all the way up. That's not really how it works. When you give certain freedoms to certain people, it will always restrict the freedoms of other people to do other things. That's just the way that freedom works. It's not a dial, it's a cut. Now, what I also wanted to get at is that whether your political ideology is on the left or the right, it doesn't really matter. What I see all the time in the underlying social imaginary is this idea of progress towards. I think progress is extremely characteristic of the world we live in, and I think it's part of this grand narrative that we're moving towards something absolute. Now, I think in the current political moment, maybe that isn't at the front of everyone's minds, but I do think it plays an important role in shaping how we understand our society and also how we look back at history.